Welcome to Part 8A. Today we're diving into a complex diplomatic decision that reveals deeper systematic challenges in international law and democratic governance. In August 2025, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced Australia will recognize Palestinian statehood at September UN General Assembly. What's fascinating about this decision is how to expose intricate tension between symbolic diplomacy, legal frameworks, and democratic legitimacy. Let's break down the key moments and legal nuances that make this story so compelling. We're seeing coordinated recognition from Western democracy, the UK, the France, and Canada all moving together. But this isn't just about a single foreign policy announcement. It's about series of interconnected diplomatic choices that create complex jurisdictional challenges. Joining us to walk through this critical decision point is Dr. Martin Kear from the University of Sydney's Department of Government and International Relations. Dr. Kear's research on Palestinian politics provides crucial insight into the precedent and systematic pattern at play. What's particularly compelling here is how this reveals fundamental question about democratic participation and external validation. Western governments are demanding Hamas exclusion from future Palestinian governance, but this creates what Dr. Kears identify as a democratic contradiction. External powers dictating the terms of democratic self-determination. To understand the broader implication, we need to look at how international recognition actually functions within existing legal frameworks. Recognition doesn't automatically create a statehood under international law that requires UN Security Council approval. So we're looking at a symbolic legitimacy without formal legal status. Yet, this symbolic dimension creates significant diplomatic weight. Dr. Kears bring a unique analytical perspective to these systematic challenges. He's drawn comparison to international intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, highlighting how externally exposed government structure can undermine the very democratic principle they claim to support. This isn't just about Australia's foreign policy choices, but how our legal frameworks handle complex situations where symbolic actions intersect with substantive political change. The domestic political dimension add another layer. Opposition leader Susan Lee is calling for reversal, arguing the decision is fundamentally flawed because Hamas has praised it. As we'll see, the real story is often more nuanced than the headline suggests. It's less about a single recognition decision and more about interconnected legal and political mechanisms that create diplomatic leverage in entrenched conflict. Now, let's go to the episode. Please welcome to the show at Part 8A, Dr. Martin Kier.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. So there's this is a big issue happening right now. So why did let me what do you think? Why did Australia the timing recognize this statehood, Palestine statehood?
I think that momentum had been growing for a long time. There was the suffering of Gazans, the unwillingness of Israel to stop the humanitarian catastrophe that was being inflicted upon Gazans. So I think that there was a concerted diplomatic effort from France and Canada and the UK and other states to really change the the status quo of the situation by recognizing a Palestinian state, and give them more impetus to change what's happening in the territories, trying to force Israel to make peace with Hamas to stop the suffering of Gazans, and to push forward the idea of the two-state solution, so an independent Palestinian state, as a way of getting peace in the Middle East that really hasn't been present for a long time.
How does Australia recognition decision fit with its broader Middle East foreign policy objectives and regional diplomatic relationship?
Well, I think that the biggest change is that previously these Australian governments, be they the coalition or from Labor, have accepted that any negotiations and progression of a Palestinian state would take place under the auspice of the Middle East peace process. But that has been dormant and deliberately so for more than a decade. And is controlled exclusively by Israel and the United States. So Palestinians have no trust in that process uh, to move forward with the Palestinian state, and they do not see the United States as a good faith actor. So it was an effort by these states, or an acknowledgement by these states, that something different had to be done, and by recognizing Palestine, and France and Great Britain are both members of the Security Council, both members of the G7 and the G20. So there's a lot of diplomatic and economic clout that they can bring to bear. Um, so all of this starts to come together. I think they included the Arab League as a way of increasing the legitimacy and import of their announcement to say this is the institution that broadly represents the Arab world opinion, and that they can also bring pressure to bear on Hamas.
So, what makes Australia approach to Palestinian recognition, say, distinct from other G20 members who have taken similar steps?
Well, I think that this it will be announced at the next meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, and that means that if a state is recognised, so there's a whole process, and simply by these states recognising Palestine doesn't mean that there is a Palestine state that is recognised by the United Nations. That's a completely different process that has to be approved by the United Nations Security Council. So there's a block there because the United States, I don't think, will ever do that. Um, but I think this is a way of these states forcing Israel to stop the humanitarian catastrophe, stop the starvation of Gazans, um, allow these states a bit more credibility to provide aid, and to really start driving the reforms of the Palestinian Authority that need to occur.
Mhm. So, one of the issues today in the Australian politics is that there's a report saying the Hamas is eh, recognizing the Albanese that they're doing good because of this, and the opposition saying is that they are Albanese is like a brand ambassador from of Hamas because of this.
Well, I think that there's a lot of obviously there's a lot of politics involved in that, but the whole reason for Hamas resisting is to get rid of as Israeli occupation and to advance the cause of Palestinian statehood. So I think it's a natural feeling from Hamas that any diplomatic move by a state that furthers the cause of Palestinian statehood, they would accept. And I think one of uh, the things that is not mentioned particularly in the Western world is that the reason that Hamas attacked Israel is not because they hated Israel, but they needed to change the status quo of Israel's occupation. There was the normalization and permanence of that occupation that made any chance of a Palestinian state almost non-existent. So Hamas made the decision that things needed to change, that they had to conduct such an attack to change the situation and to bring resolving the Palestinian question to international consensus. Now they've said this they published two documents, one in 2023 and one in 2024, that outlined why they attacked. But that is simply ignored by the West because it doesn't suit their narrative about why terrorist movements attack.
Mhm. So I said opposition leader Susan Lee called on Prime Minister Albanese to reverse Australian recognition of Palestinian statehood, arguing that this decision was fundamentally flawed because Hamas has praised this move. What is your opinion on this one?
I mean,
Because
it's again, there's politics in that. I mean, the opposition leader is playing politics with it. I mean, there is. I mean, the government has announced that they will recognise Palestine. I think it's politically unfortunate that Hamas has come out in support of that decision because it does allow for that sort of attack. I don't think that gets very much traction amongst Australian voters, given that 300,000 people marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge a couple of weeks ago in protest against, I think, not only what was happening in Gaza, but the government's unwillingness or seeming unwillingness to do anything really about it. And I think recognition is the very least they could have done. I mean, they could have imposed sanctions on the Israeli government. They could refuse to supply parts to the F-35 fighters that are being used against Palestinians. We don't supply parts directly to Israel, but we do supply parts that make it into the planes or make it to Israel indirectly. So we could have done a lot of things. We could have recalled our ambassador to Israel in protest. We could have expelled the Israeli ambassador in protest. So recognition is at the very smaller end of that scale. It's still, I think, an important step because it does show Israel that the international community are not willing to simply lay down and accept exactly what Israel says without repercussions.
Mhm. So Western governments require Hamas exclusion from the future Palestinian governance. How
Yes.
does this condition affect democratic legitimacy and, say, determination principle?
Yeah, I mean it's been a point I've been trying to make, certainly in the article I published in the conversation, but also in the media interviews. If we want Palestine to be a democratic state, then it should be up to Palestinians to decide who does and doesn't represent them. Now, it should be Hamas should be able to take part in that political process if Palestinians vote for Hamas. And that's if a majority of Palestinians, vote for Hamas, then we need to accept in any elections. We need to accept that result. In the same case, we should have accepted the election result in 2006, the elections that Hamas won, which were the first free, fair, and open elections in the Arab world. So it wasn't as though Hamas won by subterfuge. Hamas won those legitimately. And if you look at the Palestinian polls that have been done every quarter, Hamas is just as popular, if not more popular, than Fatah, who is the other major Palestinian movement. And the reason for this is that Hamas is willing to resist Israeli occupation, and Fatah is not. And Fatah is known to be corrupt and nepotistic, and is just guilty of bureaucratic malfeasance. Everyone knows this. The government knows this. The international, everyone, the United Nations, which is why they have all these reforms that needs to take place. So there does need to be elections in 2000 for the Palestinian Legislative Council and for the presidency. And I think if any new government or any new president wants to be considered legitimate by the Palestinian people, then Hamas has to be part of that process. Because if they are deliberately excluded, not by Palestinians, but by Western governments who are all colonial governments, then it just looks like the old colonial masters dictating how we run politics. And I don't think that government will be considered as legitimate, particularly if it consists predominantly of Fatah, who are already unpopular, and we run the very great risk of repeating the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan.
So this is a big scenario situation. So we know that President Mahmoud Abbas facing 80% disapproval rating.
Yes.
What credible leadership alternative exist for Palestinian Authority reform?
Well, that again, I think that's the big unknown. I mean, Abbas, like his predecessor, Yasser Arafat, has not um, had a successor in mind because he wants to continue controlling everything. He's more an authoritarian leader than he is a democratic leader. So there are potential uh, successors. How popular they will be amongst Palestinians is debatable. The one person that would have genuine popularity and it really is like the Palestinian equivalent of Nelson Mandela is Marwan Barghouti, but unfortunately he's in Israeli jail and will never be released because the Israelis know that he's the one person that can genuinely unite Palestinians. Hamas has said in the past that they would be willing to serve under a government of Marwan Barghouti. Now he's been convicted of murders of Israelis and of Palestinians, I think, but uh, there have been other Palestinians who've been committed or convicted of similar crimes and been released by Israel. But Israel will never release Marwan Barghouti because they know um, how popular he is. And Israel does not want a popular Palestinian leader who can unite the people and, probably more importantly, who can convince international states like France, Australia, Britain, Canada, and others that he is the real deal and that he speaks for Palestinians and can rule or can govern democratically.
Mhm. How do you compare the sustainability of external imposed governance structure versus Palestinian chosen leadership?
Well, I mean, I think that it just wouldn't be considered legitimate by Palestinians. Again, it would be if they're external, irrespective of which external, whether they're European or American actors, imposing governance standards on Palestinians, imposing their views on Palestinians. They simply would not accept it as legitimate, as would any person, as would any state that would be subjected to outside interference in their politics. I think if this is genuinely about achieving a Palestinian state and generally making that a democratic state, then everyone should be that should be the goal. So there should be political pluralism, as in all actors should be able to participate in elections. Now, there's no guarantee that Hamas would even want to participate in the next elections. Um, they may choose, not given the sacrifice, given the cost of this war, they may choose not to participate in any future elections. But I think the opportunity should be there for them, should they choose to do so, to participate and let the Palestinian voters be the judge of who governs them.
Mhm. So, Dr. Martin, how does this symbolic recognition translate into actual diplomatic leverage for advancing the two-state resolution?
Well, I think it does give the states that are recognising these recent states and recognition of Palestine is not a new thing. 147 states recognise the Palestinian state. It's only Western states that don't recognise Palestine in support of Israel as apparently a democratic state. But I think it gives them more leverage. I think it allows Israel to be cast as a pariah, and they would find it more difficult to withstand the diplomatic pressure. Now, there will always be the support. Israel will always have the support of the United States, but I think President Trump has shown that he doesn't follow the normal pattern. He likes to be a disruptor, a changer. So I don't think that Israel can automatically count on the support of the United States. If it suits President Trump domestically to support Israel, then he will support Israel. If it doesn't suit him domestically, if there's some alternative, then he'll go that. Or maybe he just goes, well, it doesn't really concern the United States. It doesn't really cost me domestically. It doesn't advantage me, but it doesn't cost me. So maybe I just sit on the sidelines a bit and just see how things go. Because I don't think that there is any love lost between Netanyahu and President Trump. They're very transactional politicians. So it's like, if I'm not getting anything out of this, then why am I giving anything?
I have just a hypothetical question, Dr. Martin. What if it's not Australia? What if Israel is annexing the West Bank and they plan to take over Gaza City as well, despite international recognition of Palestine? What's going to be happening?
I don't think the world is. Well, I think that's the $64 million question. I don't think that these states are willing to expend the level of political capital that would be required to stop that from happening. I mean, even at the most that the democratic states are willing to do at this point towards the Israeli government, despite all of the horrors that we see on television each night, is they issue a strongly worded statement. That's
Mhm,
that's not going to resolve anything. So yes, I mean I think there is a possibility that the
mhm.
Netanyahu government, placed under this pressure, doubles down and they do occupy Gaza City and they do annex the West Bank and they just say, well, stop us. And you can't see the United Nations committing troops on the peacekeepers on the ground. Certainly not in the West Bank. I mean that's an impossibility. No state would volunteer their troops for that, because that would be, you'd have to fight the Israeli Defense Force. So I think that is a possibility. And if that happens, then it'll be the inevitable, slow but inevitable death of the Palestinian nation.
What do you think the specific roles of Australia play in international effort to address the territorial and governance challenges you identify on this two-state
Well,
solution?
I think that that's a really interesting question, because Australia as a middle power, depending on how much the government wants to do, I think can have a very strong role. If you look back in history, they provided the Australian government provided the impetus for the peace agreement in Cambodia in 1988, and acted as a good faith negotiator within that process. Um, so I think again, depending on what the government wants to do, how much does the government want to do? I think it could play a role in reforming, in playing, perhaps not negotiating between the Palestinians and Israelis, but perhaps driving that reform process. It's not one of the big powers. It hasn't got colonial. I mean, we're a colonial state, but we're not Britain or France. So there's not that underlying animosity between towards Australia. So I think there's the opportunity there. It just depends on how much the government wants to do and how much political capital it is willing to expend.
Thank you so much for that. My last question to you is, what lesson from other statehood recognition process could guide more effectively approaches to a Palestinian sovereignty?
Well, I think the Palestinian case is unique because it's Palestine, the occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem have been occupied since 1967. And Israel has done everything in its power to make that occupation permanent. Um, the settlements in the West Bank and around East Jerusalem are designed. The settlements in the West Bank are designed to expropriate Palestinian land with the view of making any future state impracticable. Its settlements around East Jerusalem are designed and positioned specifically to prevent any future division of the city. And Palestinians simply will not accept a state without East Jerusalem as its capital, which is another one of the problems that is inevitable with this particular situation. So personally, I do not think that there will ever be a sovereign Palestinian state, because Israel will never withdraw its settlements and will never give up half control of East Jerusalem, and the international community will never be in a position to force Israel to do either of those sorts of things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin Kear, a sessional lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at University of Sydney. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's another episode of Part 8A under Minkari News, and see you again next week.